Hello and welcome to the Quantitative Methods in Retail Supply Chain Part 2. This presentation is the second half of our analytics webinar series that we presented in August. My name is Kevin Stadler. I'm the President and CEO of 4R Systems, and I will be monitoring this session. This webinar will be recorded and will be available post-event on our website at 4rsystems.com/webinars. There you'll also be able to find the recording of part 1 of this series. As a little note before we get started, all the phone lines are currently muted and will remain muted throughout the presentation. We will be taking questions via the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and the questions will be answered at the end of the session. We will answer as many questions as possible that time allows. And now I'd like to introduce your presenter, Stefano Alberti, who is our Senior Vice President of Analytics. Stefano?
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to be back for the second episode of our exploration of quantitative methods in retail supply chain. So as you probably remember from part 1, we touched topics regarding specific decisions involving inventory within the retail supply chain, and that had to do with what to buy, how much to buy, and where and when to put it, specifically in the stores or other fulfillment channels. And these decisions are all affected by uncertainty in different ways. So what we're going to do today is to look at some of these aspects from a different point of view within a more structured framework. And we'll use a fairly common taxonomy to define that framework. And this taxonomy lives on 2 dimensions. One that describes the product type, and the other one that describes the life cycle stage that the product finds itself in. So let's start with product type, which in this table is represented by either of those two columns. So let's start with short life cycle. The meaning of short life cycle, there are many ways to define it, but let's say that it's when vendor lead time is longer than the product life cycle. Now what this means is that, for example, if we're looking at a seasonal product whose selling season may be 4 or 5 months, if the procurement cycle, meaning the time to place the order with the vendor procuring the items either from the manufacturer or manufacturing themselves, and then shipping it to the retailer, if that time exceeds the 4 or 5 month selling season, then there is no opportunity to rebuy, and basically we call this a short life cycle. We also call it one and done, or anything to that effect. Of course, the opposite of short life cycle is a long life cycle, where the vendor lead time is shorter than the product life cycle, and usually the product life cycle is much longer than the procurement cycle, and this allows the retailer to place 1 or 2 or actually usually very many rebuys, and basically this is the most common situation for longer life cycle products, where product is flowed in from a vendor on a periodic basis based on inventory needs, and then deployed at the stores or the other fulfillment channels where demand is observed and subsequent orders with the vendor are placed. So this is our dichotomy of the world of life cycle, short and life. From a life cycle stage, instead, we have birth, midlife, and retirement that we call the procurement, which is basically the process of bringing product from the supplier or vendor into the retailer's supply chain. Then we have the ongoing process of ensuring profitable fulfillment of consumer demand. So this may mean on a daily or weekly basis sending inventory to the stores. And then approaching the retirement date of the product, we have what we can call sunset. Now sunset, of course, involves also managing inventory, moving inventory to a fulfillment place, channel or store it might be. But the more interesting aspect has to do with pricing, and what we can define as managing exiting the product via price lever. And we'll see in a little bit why we use these terms. So we have a 3x2 matrix, 3 life cycle stages for short life cycle and long life cycle products. Just about any inventory decisions within a retail supply chain will fall in one of these 6 cells. Today, we're going to focus on 1 or 2 of these cells and do a little bit of a deeper dive, specifically in terms of process and measuring performance. So what we call the one and done buy is a short life cycle procurement, and usually this is a single order placed with a vendor many months ahead of the start of the selling season. And that's because usually being a seasonal item, it needs to be manufactured, spec'd out manufactured, and then transported in usually from overseas to the vendor's own distribution centers and eventually to the stores. And there is not enough time to go through that cycle more than once during the life cycle of the item, so there is no rebuy. And because of this, it's basically a blind buy, which means that the retailer has to place the order prior to observing any sales or any demand. And so there is a little bit of a gamble going on. This is a very well known problem of investing resources ahead of an uncertain scenario. Sometimes the retailer can rely on prior season sales of the same or similar products to provide directional guidance on the quantity to buy, but it still represents a blind gamble to the most extent. And as such, the retailer is walking a fine line between buying too much and buying too little. And each of those excesses or errors have associated consequences on the profit. Underbuying means that the retailer would have been able to sell more had they had more, and so that's a lost profit. Overbuying, conversely, presents the retailer with an inventory overhang, which means obsolescence, excessive markdowns, sometimes even write-offs. So let's look at now at the 2 for the seasonal items, short life cycle. At the 2 are actually 3 elements combined, both the one and done buy and the in-season markdowns, because what we call the sunset or managing the exit of the product for a short life cycle product actually represents the in-season repricing or markdowns after the initial rollout of the product at the initial full retail. So first of all, contrary to popular belief a little bit, markdowns for seasonal items are not just a damage control tool for product that may be overbought. In fact, they represent even more so a sort of insurance policy that allows the season buys to be more aggressive. And this is exactly what I mean. If a retailer had no recourse to markdowns and they would have to stick to the original retail price, they would have to be much more conservative in placing their buys, because in case of an overbuy, they would have not a lot of options to get out of the product profitably without being able to stimulate demand with markdowns. So it is true that after the season starts, markdowns are a damage control. But prior to the start of the season, actually prior to even placing the buys, markdowns allow the retailer to buy more aggressively across the board, so that the more successful items will be sold generating good profit, whereas the less successful items can be managed near or at profitability or even just be slightly below profitability via markdowns. And so it's that ability to leverage or modulate demand once we are in season that allows the retailer to be more aggressive across the board and capitalize on those products, those SKUs that actually turned out to be successful, and being able to sell them at or near full retail. In particular, the ability to leverage the markdown lever is not uniform across the board. You know, a common finding is that the more price elastic an item is, the more we can modulate demand through the price lever. And in turn, that means that the product itself can be bought more aggressively, because if we end up overbought, we are going to get out of a overbought situation more profitably, or I should say less unprofitably, if we can modulate demand more using the price lever than if we couldn't. In other words, if taking a 20% markdown will, for sake of example, double demand, then it's one thing. If taking a 20% markdown will only up demand by 15 or 20%, then there is not a lot of lever or leverage that price we can exert through price, and probably if we overbought, we are going to see a lot of overhang and obsolescence at the end of the season. So at this point, the main question we're dealing with today is, how do we know if we're doing a good job managing seasonal goods? Where managing seasonal goods is really a combination of three different actions: the season buy, the allocation, so sending the product to the stores throughout the season, and then the markdown. The markdown is not necessarily for a seasonal product. It's not necessarily an end of season or a discontinuation event related pricing. Actually, markdown is something that occupies most of the season and can even begin just a few weeks after the initial rollout. In fact, some fashion retailers report that only 10 to 15% of their sales occur at full retail, and everything else, the 85% of sales, actually at some discounted price, starting very early in the season. So the main question is, how do we know if we're doing a good job? What is the metric that really allows us to determine the performance? Is it the net margin dollars, which is eventually the ultimate contribution to the bottom line? Or is it the return on investment? Or is it sell-through? Actually, the answer is none of the above, because when we talk about measuring the performance of how a seasonal item is managed from procurement to sunset, we must compare how the item actually performed with its full potential, and how the full potential, what portion of the full potential is captured through an appropriate strategy of combined buy, markdown, and allocation strategy. So this, of course, we're talking about measuring performance after the end of the season, where we know exactly what happened. So let's introduce a concept which is a season, we call it season full price demand. It's basically, for a seasonal item, what demand would be if we had to keep, we decide to keep the price at full retail throughout, and whenever there is a stock out, if there is a stock out, we knew how to stock out correct. So basically infer demand from sales, because sales are a censored representation of demand. Censored in the sense that when inventory is not available to fulfill demand, most likely we experience a low sales. So if you could unconstrain sales and observe true demand and refer that demand at full retail price, that's what we call season full price demand. An interesting metric, intermediate metric that we use is the buy index. The buy index is basically the ratio between the amount of inventory bought, the number of units bought for a given product, and its season full price demand. Of course, this quantity, the buy index, is only known after the season has ended, when we have hindsight into what season full price demand was. So before we actually look at this buy index, let's look at a similar metric, which is the ratio of buy to demand, but not the demand, the full price demand, but the demand we actually observed with whatever markdowns have been put in place. So this data is from a retailer for a particular season for a retailer with a few hundred products, different SKUs, and these are categorized in different buckets of season to buy demand ratio. So the way we read this histogram is, for example, that bar at the 2.0, which represents about 6% of the SKUs. What this means is that at the end of the season, it turned out that 6% of those SKUs had a season buy equal to twice the actual demand. So we can say they were twice, overbought by a factor of 2. Now, once again, this is actual demand. From actual demand, we can infer the full price demand. Of course, whenever there is a markdown, full price demand was actually smaller because it means what would have demand been without the effect of markdowns. So what happens if we look at the same histogram, but using full price demand? What happens is that demand, the full price demand is the blue bars, demand all of a sudden shifts to the right. There are more items, more overbought. And this obviously, it is so because the retailer will consciously modulate demand for the items that are more overbought. So for example, the overbought index value of 2.0 represents about 16% of all SKUs. So 60% of those SKUs, almost 1/6 of those SKUs were overbought twice their full price demand. Now, probably with all their inventory, the retailer somewhere halfway through the season or during the season realized that they needed to increase demand, and they did so by employee markdowns. Employee markdowns, what it does, it increases demand and shifts the ratio toward the left, toward lower overbought situations. Of course, once we consider the effect of markdown on demand. Now, why is the blue? We're going to work with the blue flavor of this histogram, what I call the buy index, which is, if you will, a measure of how overbought a product is prior to taking any markdowns. Another way of looking at it is how well the retailer guessed what the true demand was going to be and how they calibrated their buy accordingly. So we looked at the shifting effect of markdowns. So once we have this concept under our belt, let's go back and look at different metrics of performance. So let's start with ROI, return on investment, which is just the season sales dollars. Basically, it's the net profit over the cost, not just cost of goods sold, but cost of the buy. And the difference being that if there is any inventory overhang or unsold inventory, that must be factored in because it's money that the retailers wrote a check for. Another way of looking at this is just season sales, the ratio of season sales to season buy at cost minus 1. And the problem the reason why return on investment doesn't quite work very well in telling us how well we did is because it tends to artificially reward underbought products where demand far outstrips supply. So we were able to sell everything, possibly almost everything, at full retail price, achieving a possibly very high return on investment. Now, this is data from different retailer, a collection of seasons. Every dot represents a SKU, and we are showing how every SKU performed in terms of return on investment as a function of the buy index. Once again, dots to the left are, if you will, tight buys, and dots to the right are overbuys. So as we can see here, toward the far right of this chart, these are severely overbought products where even the most aggressive markdowns didn't manage to squeeze even positive profit out of it. Whereas far to the left of this chart, we have products with a very high return on investment, but that's because they turned out to be bought too tightly. And that's why essentially return on investment is not a good measure of performance. It just tells us how tight or how overbought the product was. So if return on investment is not a good measure of performance, what about margin dollars? Because like we said, margin dollars is eventually the quantity that contributes directly to the bottom line of the retailer. So it is legitimate to think that if we want to maximize margin dollars, then margin dollars ought to be a pretty good measure of performance. Well, it turns out that it's not, for an opposite reason, which is margin dollars tend to reward high volume products, regardless of the quality of the execution, by allocation and markdown. Now, there is a lot of noise, and all the dispersion in the data represents different parameters, how overbought the item was, markdown strategy, initial markup, and so forth. But and by the way, here on the horizontal axis, we don't have the buy index. We have just the absolute buy, because the point we're trying to make here is that the ROI correlates quite directly with the volume of the item. You know, is this a 1,000 unit kind of item or a 10,000 unit kind of item? Especially within the same retailer where margins don't necessarily fluctuate a lot, then what drives the margin percent, what drives margin dollars is really the volume of the product, unit volume. So we came up with this more fine-tuned metric to measure actual performance. We call it realized margin sell-through. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but basically what it is the ratio of the total gross profit, which is basically sales dollars minus the buy at cost, the ratio of this to the total potential margin. Total potential margin is basically the total full price season demand evaluated at full margin. So in other words, is the value of the full price demand once all the effects of stockouts and markdowns are taken out. If you remember the blue histogram a few slides back. So the value of that full price demand is evaluated at the margin, where the margin is the initial margin that the item is rolled out at. If you will, it's the true demand evaluated at full margin. Now, the potential margin represents an upper bound on the actual realized margin. And what's most important is that the potential margin does not depend on the size of the buy, because what it depends on is just the true demand that's out there for the product and the margin chosen by the retailer. Now, if the margin changes, meaning that, for example, the retailer decides to roll out this product at a higher price, then they, of course, will determine a smaller full price season demand, which may lead to possibly a smaller or higher, depends on the circumstances, potential margin. But once the retailer has decided the margin, the price that they will sell the product initially at, then that uniquely identifies the potential margin. And how much of the potential margin is captured by the actual season for the product is what we call realized margin sell-through. So probably this is better explained with an example. Let's say that this is a product that we buy 1,000 units of at a unit cost from the supplier of $5, and we plan on selling it initially for $10. Throughout the season, we start with an initial period where we're able to sell 200 units of the product, a full price. Then we take a first markdown at $750, and there we sell an additional 400 units. And finally, we take a second and last markdown down to $5, 50% markdown, to sell an additional 300 units. And by the time the out day comes around, there's still a 100 units unsold, which will write off, basically bringing in zero revenue. So the total, of course, is a 1,000 units sold. 1,000 units bought. We sold 900 of those, and the total sales dollars are $6,500. Now let's go back and let's make the assumption that the true full price demand was 500 units. This is the basically the demand that's out there for this product at $10. So 500 units corresponds to $2,500 of potential margin, because the initial margin is $5, so 5 times 500 is 2,500. The realized margin is equal to sales dollars minus the procurement cost, which is 5,000. So it's $1,500. So of those $2,500 of potential margin, we only capture $1,500, which gives us a retail realized margin sell-through of 60% for this specific example. Now, what's interesting is to look at the same data that we looked at earlier in these charts, but evaluated against this metric of performance. And this is what it looks like. Again, on the horizontal axis, we have the buy index. Once again, to the right of this chart, we have products that were very heavily bought, turned out to be overbought. To the left of this chart, we have products that were very lightly bought, so they turned out to be underbought. And of course, in between, we have products that were bought somewhat correctly. So a couple of points to note about this chart. Here, to the left, the realized margin sell-through is relatively low, because even though we did well, we probably sold a full retail and we sold out, but we could have sold more had we bought more. So this is a little bit of an indictment of the buy being too tight and leaving money on the table with respect to what the potential capture margin is. At the other side of the spectrum, we have overbought items where the realized margin sell-through is low because we had to take heavy markdowns to move inventory, and possibly even the effect of unsold inventory. Unsold inventory or heavily marked down inventory weighs in dragging down the realized margin sell-through, because the inventory cost is all there, but the sales dollars are much depressed by either markdowns or unsold inventory altogether. So if we look at, there is a center region approximately between 1.0 and 2.0, meaning that the product was bought equally to demand, or maybe no more than 2x demand. In that region, it's possible through markdowns to achieve a reasonably good realized margin sell-through. Once again, the realized margin sell-through has an upper bound of 100%, where 100% would be when we buy perfectly and we execute a perfect allocation and a perfect markdown strategy, which are, it's a very unusual trifecta of factors to get right to begin with. But even 80 or 90 or high 90% is to be considered a very strong performance. So wrapping up, we looked at a number of different performance measures, and each of them has a shortcoming because they don't tell us exactly how the item performed in relative terms across the different decisions that affect the financial performance. Again, the buy, the allocation, and the markdown. The realized margin sell-through, on the other hand, gives us a comprehensive picture of the financial performance in a way that is comparable across different products, even though they represent different volumes, different initial margins, different even different supply chain parameters possibly, and different markdown strategies. So let's recap here, looking at the taxonomy. What we've done today was to look at a short life cycle measurement of financial performance, which is just one section of the retail taxonomy. Possibly next time we will explore more in detail some other areas of this retail taxonomy, both in terms of location and what decisions contribute to the financial success of a well-executed strategy. That concludes the talk. If we have any questions today.
We're going to be taking questions via the chat feature on the right-hand side, so give a minute for anyone to type in any questions they have.
Thank you, Jessica.
We do have one question. It is, what is wrong with measuring performance via regular sell-through?
Excellent question. Regular sell-through, inventory sell-through, or even retail sell-through is a commonly used measure, but unfortunately it suffers the same limitation the ROI does, which basically tends to favor SKUs that are underbought, where demand outstrips supply, and so by definition we will sell all or most of what we bought. So it really doesn't measure the quality of the buy. It measures, once we have that buy amount, how do we execute on the allocation and possibly on the markdown strategy. So it only gives us a partial picture, leaves out the quality of the buy altogether. That was a good question.
Great. We do have another question. It is, aren't short and long life cycle markdowns fundamentally different?
That's another good question. Unfortunately, we haven't had time today to look at the second half of this taxonomy, but if we look at the sunset of the retirement, in-season markdowns, end-of-life markdowns, they actually they are deceivingly dissimilar, in the sense that there are more similarities than not. Even though in-season markdowns, it's just that it's a repricing of inventory to stimulate demand in a more profitable way, and end-of-life markdowns represent an exit strategy on a replenishment product that, after possibly many years of replenishment life, is discontinued and phased out. If you look at the economic drivers of those situations, they're very similar, because at the point in time where we consider markdowns, we have a fixed amount of inventory. If it's in season, if it's a seasonal product, because, well, it's the one and done buy without rebuy opportunity. If it's a long life cycle, at that point in time, we have decided to discontinue, so we're not placing any more vendor orders. So for all practical purposes, it is a fixed supply situation that as well. And we also have an out date, which may be more or less fixed out in the future. Usually for seasonal product, it's more fixed because there is a reset of the store to make room for the next season. For long life cycle, sometimes it's more sales driven, but there is always a range of out dates that the retailer needs to work with, because they have to plan for replacement items. So once we have those two constraints, of those two factors, I should say, fixed supply and somewhat fixed out date, then the price lever becomes a common tool to achieve max profitability, which, since inventory is at some cost at that point, is the same thing as max sales dollars, max revenue. If
there are no more questions, this concludes the presentation. This webinar will be available on our website at 4rsystems.com/webinars, as well as part 1. Thank you.
Thank you.